Dr. Clark shared that Gandhi used nonviolence as a strategy, but not as a way of life, and that he always had another option waiting in the wings in case nonviolence didn't work. And this was his disagreement with Dr. King because he supported nonviolence as a strategy, but not as a way of life. Hola mi gente, MsMalcolmHughes here. Welcome back. Today we're going to go over chapter 2, the Black Power chapter of Where Do We Go From Here by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this time I'm going to start by reading an excerpt that I think really hits at the focal point of this chapter, and then we'll unpack it and discuss it together. While the concept of legitimate Black power might be detonatively sound, the slogan Black Power carried the wrong connotations. I mentioned the implications of violence that the press had already attached to the phrase, and I went on to say that some of the rash statements on the part of a few marchers only reinforced this impression. Stokely replied by saying that the question of violence versus nonviolence was irrelevant. The real question was the need for Black people to consolidate their political and economic resources to achieve power. Power, he said, is the only thing respected in this world, and we must get it at any cost. Right now is a conversation between Dr. King and Stokely Carmichael. Then he looked me squarely in the eye and said, "Martin, you know as well as I do that practically every other ethnic group in America has done just this. The Jews, the Irish, and the Italians did it. Why can't we?" "That is just the point," I answered. "No one has ever heard the Jews publicly chant a slogan of Jewish power, but they have power. Through group unity, determination, and creative endeavor, they have gained it. The same thing is true of the Irish and Italians. Neither group has used the slogan of Irish or Italian power, but they have worked hard to achieve it. This is exactly what we must do," I said. "We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. This is the kind of legitimate power we need. We must work to build racial pride and refute the notion that Black is ugly and evil. But this must come through a program, not merely through a slogan." So the person entering the conversation now is Floyd McKissick, and he was the National Director of CORE, which stands for the Congress of Racial Equality. Stokely and Floyd insisted that the slogan itself was important. How can we arouse people to unite around a program without a slogan as a rallying cry? Didn't the labor movement have slogans? Haven't we had slogans all along in the Black freedom movement? What we need is a new slogan with Black in it. I conceded the fact that we must have slogans, but why have one that will confuse our allies, isolate the Negro community, and give many prejudiced whites who might otherwise be ashamed of their anti-Negro feeling a ready excuse for self-justification? Why not use the slogan Black consciousness or Black equality, I suggested. These phrases would be less vulnerable and would more accurately describe what we are about. The words Black and power together give the impression that we are talking about Black domination rather than Black equality. Stokely responded that neither would have the ready appeal and persuasive force of Black power. With that, I love that behind the scenes conversation that we get when we look back at history, because I think that often we have these idealized views of heroic figures, and they were average people trying to do the work. They were people trying to do the work. And so I love that. And here, and what we see throughout the chapter, is really that divisiveness within the Black community of where are we going, hence the title. But the civil rights movement, there was progress, but it wasn't as transformational as we wanted. We want rapid change. And so there becomes this push for Black power, right? Where it is more force, less passivity. And so we see a little bit of that in that argument, and Dr. King unpacks a lot of this in the chapter, that real divide between what we've been doing, what we're trying to achieve, and the best means of getting there. Dr. King is also one who was against separatism, and that's something he unpacks here as well, is that Black power is unachievable through separatism, and that we have to have coalitions and alliances in order to have true progress. With that, as we grow and evolve and we learn new things, I think our feelings can change. So for me, I think that coalitions working together is possible. I think, however, there is a strong need for vigilance and a constant state of vigilance. Because I think that when we say the statements of, when a lot of times allies are like, what can I do to help? And it's like, you can go home and have these difficult conversations at the dinner table and talk to the people in your family who are oppressors or who have biases or racist ideals or microaggressions, right? So it's tricky, right? So it's like, if we each work on what we need to work on, then we can come back together stronger. And so I do believe that, right? I do believe that Black people know what Black people need and what Black people want. And oftentimes other people just need to get out of the way and make sure that we have the resources to achieve it. And resources, and not in as a handout, resources as in what we are owed. One thing that really stood out for me is an argument by Dr. Clark, which I think is super important, because Dr. King was as you all know, a supporter of nonviolence. That was his movement. That was his mission. He stood on that. That's a lot of what he talked about in chapter 1. Even here in chapter 2 with Black Power and the forms of resistance that were beginning to emerge more frequently or more publicly, because Black people have always resisted by any means, whether that's nonviolence or violence. Dr. Clark says something, and it made me think of this chapter, and I'm going to share it. Dr. Clark shared that Gandhi used nonviolence as a strategy, but not as a way of life, and that he always had another option waiting in the wings in case nonviolence didn't work. And this was his disagreement with Dr. King, because he supported nonviolence as a strategy, but not as a way of life. And so that's Dr. Clark. He thought that it could be an effective strategy, but it couldn't be the only strategy. And I actually really agree with that way of thinking, and just that analysis and the method in which nonviolence can be used, again, as a strategy, as one form of resistance, but not the entire movement for resistance. But another thing is that Dr. Clark said that we should be slow to criticize Dr. King, because the fact that we are sitting here and he is not speaks to his bravery over ours, and I felt that that was an entire word. And so whether you disagree or not, he gave the ultimate sacrifice for what he believed and to help achieve what he desired, which was the liberation of Black people. So even with this chapter in the unpacking of what does it mean to have Black liberation, right? What form should that take? What measures should we take in our attempt to get there? I think we have to be mindful of that. I'm someone who, I get his argument about Black power, but I think that we needed something empowering for people who have been taught to hate themselves for such a long period of time. But I do get what Dr. King's saying about it being divisive, but that's the same thing we've experienced in modern day with the Black Lives Matter movement. You also have to be conscientious of the fact that, or just the statement of Black Lives Matter, right? Don't want to get into the movement, but just the statement of Black Lives Matter. Yes, Black Lives matter. Black lives have always mattered. Black lives will always matter. And a lot of people took issue with it because they said that in saying that Black lives matter, you're saying that other lives don't matter. And that's not what was said, right? It's saying that here's this group of people whose lives you have not honored, respected, or valued. These lives matter, right? And so I feel the same way about Black power. Is not to take anything away from any other group. It is to empower or to place emphasis and highlight this group that has been done wrong for a very long time. And so with this chapter, I think that Dr. King and others that he mentions, discussion that he has, they do a really good job of unpacking what all of it means, what it meant in that time. But I think one of the most profound things about this book is that a lot of the arguments and philosophies that are included here are still relevant today. And I think there's so much knowledge to be taken from it, from what worked and what didn't, that can still be applied today in our push for complete liberation. And so, again, I always think it's worth reading, but I think this chapter in particular, because even when we think about Black history and Dr. King's place in the lineage of freedom fighters, there's always this huge dichotomy. People often place him at a stark opposition to Black power in that movement, but we forget that he was of that time. He was there, right? We often put him like he was before it. Yeah, for what it became like the Black Panther Party, but he was still there initially, and he was still a thought partner, and he still knew these people intimately, and they had conversations, right? And so I think it's really important to understand his stance on it rather than just to continue putting forth this false ideal that he didn't understand it. He actually talks a lot about how he does understand the direction that things were going as far as the Black Power movement and what would ultimately become like the Black Panther Party. So I think this chapter is a critical chapter in understanding the full scope of Dr. King's philosophical ideals about Black liberation, where we are and where we're going. So definitely worth checking out. As always, if you've read it, let me know. If you are planning to read it, let me know. And drop some comments below. But definitely worth checking out. One last thing before I go, I want to share the book that I'm currently reading so that you all may know what book reviews are coming in the near future. And the book that I'm currently reading is The Merciless Ones by Namina Forna. And this is the sequel to The Gilded Ones. So I'm enjoying it. I have a lot of thoughts about it, but that's to come in a future video. As always, I am MsMalcolmHughes, one who believes that books are sometimes better than people. And until the next one, please remember to continue to give time, to be kind to each other, and to have the best day of your life on purpose. Peace. Odabo. Adios. Ciao.